sometimes you can't hear the substance because of the noise of the appearance.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Eliot.
And I have I have something to say about the day that today is, the day we're recording, as well as the day that this episode will come out.
Okay.
So today is actually Michelle Fewer's birthday. And Michelle's she was one of our first members of our team. Aw, kind of.
She's a member
kind
of
of
our
like
team.
a member of the team. She was one of the first people to join the Facebook group. Very active supporter, always chimes in on the conversation. So very, very happy birthday to Michelle.
Happy birthday.
And the day that this podcast will actually drop on Tuesday is National Napping Day.
There's a National Napping Day. Huh.
No, you don't have to cut that out, Tom, by the way. That was me snoring.
That was a real
snoring. So just I thought everyone might want to know that it's National Napping Day.
So you can take a nap after.
Right.
Listen, or before and be refreshed to listen. And you might have to be refreshed to listen to this podcast.
Yeah, more on that in a minute.
Yeah, more on that in a minute. But first, let me welcome two new members of the community. And it appears to me that you always get to welcome the people who are named. I'd like to welcome Joe Smith. Right. I'd like to welcome.
There's literally a reason I said, why don't you mention the new people?
Why don't you? So,
which means we're sorry if we botch your names.
I'm very sorry, but we're very glad to have you. So Kelly Polyakov.
Yeah. Sorry, Kelly, if that's wrong.
Sorry, Kelly. So Kelly is right, though.
Kelly's right. Welcome, Kelly.
Right. And Winfield Zangrilli.
I think that's good. Zangrilli.
That's good. Okay.
Kelly and Winfield, we are very, very, very happy to have you.
Yes, we are.
So jump on in. Just a very quick, several of you have been grabbing our special episode through by texting the word story to 345-345. We have also created a special page at shmsbonus.com. So that's So Here's My Story short, shmsbonus.com, where you can grab that episode and hop on the list. So, all right, so let's hop into today's story. I'm going to tell you right now, it takes us a minute to get there. We didn't jump right into the thick of the point, but it is worth sticking around for if we're losing you at one point, because it really did get to something good. We talk about, we get into some really interesting distinctions between the baseline requirements to having somebody around and the more nuanced pieces and how those get so tangled when you're trying to decide whether to keep somebody or whether their work is good enough or not good enough or if it's the wrong fit. It's just one of those really tangled places I certainly get into a lot of leadership conversations around, and I think this one's really helpful. So take it away, Eliot.
Here we go. So here's my story. This goes back to my public speaking class that I teach at Towson. And I had asked the students to send in an outline for their upcoming speech. And one of the students, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to, I know at some point in this episode, refer to one of them as a girl. I know they're women. They're 19, 20 years old, but occasionally that's where my mind goes. So anyway, one of the
I don't even know what to do with that, but okay.
One of the young women, see, it's cumbersome, sent in her outline, and she was going to do an informational speech on caffeine. Mm-hmm. Now, she's a good student, and I think she's got an interesting perspective. She always comes prepared, etc. But her outline had a couple formatting problems, and she also misspelled caffeine in 3 different ways.
Okay. I understand this problem.
4 different times she mentioned caffeine and she had 3 different spellings.
So she's creative.
Okay. Or was lazy.
Or dyslexic. Go ahead.
So I sent back an email to her, and I did this really because I liked her and because I know that she's better than this. And I sent back an email and I said, "Is this the best you can do?" And that's all I sent. Now, I only sent that in because, first of all, the caffeine thing was on my mind. And it's like, it's not caffeine. I mean, come on, just look it over. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I was on my phone when I saw it. So I wasn't sitting in front of a keyboard. And third, I just didn't have a lot of block time. But I just was irritated by it because I had given this whole thing about just look it over. And, the unintended consequence, and really was unintended for me, is that it freaked her out.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
I got this long email in response about this, and maybe I should change my subject, and maybe I should do this, and maybe I should do that. And I really love your class, and I really do put effort into it, but I'm scared about what you mean. When really all I was talking about was just proofread the darn thing. And so it got me thinking that what I should have said, and then there's a problem with this too. Okay. But I thought, if I had more time, what I should have said is, hey, just do me a favor. You're fine. All I need you to say is, yeah, that's the best I can do. And if that's the best you can do, that's fine. I'll accept it. But if you can't say that, don't hit send. But then I realized how loaded a response that is.
It's even more loaded.
Yeah.
So did it occur? I'm just curious because I don't think this is the point of your story, but I have to ask, did it occur to you to just say, you need to proofread this? Or did you have were you primarily referring to the proofreading?
I was primarily referring to the proofreading, but there were formatting issues. And so sometimes she would have A and B and next would be bullet points. It just looked sloppy to me. Mm-hmm. And I know that she's better than that. And so really my intent, although I know it was snarky and I knew it was snarky when I said it, but my intent was to say, look, you're better than this. You don't have to spend 19 hours on it, but you're better than what this is. So do me a favor. And before you hit send, just make sure you can look at it and say, hey, this represents my ability. This represents who I am. This represents whatever I want to say about myself.
Okay. So I don't even take issue with the snark. The part that feels very confusing or problematic to me is actually the non-specificity of it, because is this the best you can do is so open-ended. I mean, it's basically like saying, why do you exist? Well, then your brain can go in a million different ways. Well, and you're someone that she wants to impress. And so she's going to try and think of all the ways you might mean that, hence the 92 paragraph response, I imagine. Because were you speaking substantively, or were you speaking about content or direction or depth of thought?
That's right. But at some level, when do you get to the point, and I realize it was well beyond the context of this public speaking thing, but when do you get to the point where regardless of all the different directions that I could take it, you say, yeah, this is the topic I want to do. This is the perspective I have. This is how I want to organize it. This is how I want to represent the organization. Yes, this is my best work. Grade me accordingly.
Sure. So I'm not necessarily against it, but I guess the point is, if you are in a class where you're trying to teach people things, that it goes back to something we talked about in a previous episode about like, what is the important point in that moment? Like, if clearly you didn't think it was the best that she could do, you felt like she could do better than that.
Well,
right?
But then, yes, that's true. Although I was tempted to start sending it to people just at random, even if I did think it was good. But I held off on that. Sending a note, is this the best you can do? Just see if anybody, because I was imagining if I sent that note to
Today's the day we meet Eliot's sadistic side.
If I sent that note to every single student, and I imagine myself saying to people coming in the next day, say, you know what, I sent is this the best you can do note to every single student I've had. I've had 300 students. Not one of them has ever said yes. So I was just kind of
right. So I actually love it as an expectation to set in a class to say, what I expect from you is the best you can do. And if you've done the best, I mean, it's not unlike what I said to my son when he was starting high school. I said, if you are giving it everything you got and you're getting B's or B pluses, I'm fine with that. Right. But if you're coasting and getting A minuses or A's, I'm going to be irritated. And so I like holding that bar for people. It's interesting, and I've never really thought about this distinction, is the kind of bar you set for somebody, or the difference between setting a bar for someone and then being in what will inherently, I think, although I'm just having this thought right now, is a feedback conversation. So in a feedback conversation, it feels to me like there's a need for specificity, or it's different. It feels different to me than like setting an expectation conversation.
There is definitely a need for specificity. But I was and the reason I told the story was not really
You're missing the point, Jody.
No. But no, you've hit the point. But what I'm saying is I wasn't really telling it to delve more deeply into the student-teacher thing, because I get that the response was lacking in a student-teacher feedback point of view. But where it got me thinking is, if in a job environment, so if one of my lawyers turned in this brief that they were going to file, am I within my, not just within my rights, but is it a valid response to say, okay, is this the best you can do?
See, I don't think of it in terms of valid responses, non-valid responses, invalid. Whatever, valid or not. You can say whatever you want. I think it's a context of what results are you trying to get, short term and longer term. I would take it out of the teacher context and say, if I was setting an example for a culture in my company or at performance review time, it's like, I always want you, before you submit something, to scan it and say, is this the best I can do? Is this, that to me feels like I actually really like that as a construct because I would hope that sometimes it would actually make somebody stop working on something at a time when, they can spend another 10 hours to tweak the last 5 words or something that maybe don't maybe that time could be better invested someplace else. But so I like that as that expectation. I think if you submit something and somebody's only response back is this the best you can do? Oh, I think this is my issue with it. I don't think there is ever a time where somebody throws that as a question as opposed to a statement of what I expect. If you're throwing it as a question, I think it comes with an inherent assumption that you don't think it is. And then the person has to guess in what way they have not met your...
Well, I think that, yes, unless you establish the culture, then I'm always going to ask that question, that's always going to be a self-check. Then yes, it does come with that inherent expectation that it was only asked because the answer of no was self-evident to me.
Right.
However, I do think that there's a value at some point to being able to look even at my students and say, if I ask you this question, if I asked you, each of you, this question on whatever you're submitting, how many of you would have been able to say in good conscience, yes?
Absolutely. My only beef with that question is the exact place in which it is applied without any kind of construct around it. I think, saying that, like if after the fact, saying to the class, if I asked all of you, was that last thing you submitted, was that the best? How many of you could say yes? It's being used as, in that case, not an expectation, but as like a check-in versus, I'll go back to what I was saying before. It comes back to the moment in which you're using it and what outcome you're trying to get. It's just hard for me to imagine any place that question is used that it doesn't trigger anxiety in the other person if there's no construct set. Which
in one respect is the beauty of it. But okay, so let's go back to what you said about the construct then, because I think that's important. If you establish that this is the part of the culture, that the expectation is that this is the best you can do.
The expectation is whenever you send me something, if I ask you, is this the best you can do? Your answer will be yes.
Okay, but I think then that in establishing that culture, because I think that can be valuable, in establishing that culture, there has to be some sort of guideline. So for example, you had mentioned that yes, maybe if you spend 10 more hours, you can improve it by 2%. And so the answer to the question technically was, no, I'm submitting 98%, so it's not the best I could do, but it's the best I can do reasonably, or in proportion to the assignment, or in proportion to the amount of money we're being paid for this, or whatever. So I think that and this is where I really fault myself on it, if I want to be able to ask that question, because I believe I do, then I think that I have to first set up the context and the guidelines against which I expect that answer to be measured. And I think it's interesting for the company. And so I've been giving thought to, well, what are the guidelines that I would establish in my own company for that work product? Right.
Because while I know this, that we're not talking about a teacher-student relationship as much here, in that context, it absolutely, the person is inherently, blatantly on a learning curve. Like that's why they're there. They're there to learn something. So of course you can't use the same yardstick that you would at the end of the class as you would in the first week of the class, because the whole point is they're going to be getting better as far as what the output looks like. It's why this can be important is this the best you can do? Because you can't just say, is this thing perfect? Because
no,
they don't
say, is it perfect?
Right,
Absolutely
because they don't know what, they're not able to do perfect yet. Even we could even talk about whether perfect is a good goal regardless. That gets back to my like working extra long in the last 2% bit. But I don't think it's a huge stretch to say that, to take that over into any kind of employee situation where there are times where people are on a learning curve, and then there are times where they're expected to already know. And those are different expectations. And so it's interesting that there is something about is this the best that you can do, that it kind of levels out that.
It does level out the playing field because, yes, it captures people where they are at the moment. Is this the best you can do now? But when you separate the learning curve from kind of the baseline, I think that's important. So if, again, in my firm, if we're talking about a brief and
not underwear, right?
Not underwear, a written brief. And so there's a baseline to that. You should be able to come in and say that the spelling, the sentence structure, the format in accordance with what the court requires.
Like I know nothing about briefs, and if I tried to write one for you, it may not look nothing like a brief and have none of the pieces it should have, but it should be, the spelling should be good, the grammar should be good, it should not have coffee stains on it.
Correct. So, appearance and all that stuff. So there's a baseline. Gotcha. Where you have to answer, is that the best you can do? The baseline, you should be able to say yes. That's the best it should be. It's not best I can do. It's what it should be. Is this right? Yes.
Well, that's interesting because then that takes this whole story in another context, because your beef with her work, I don't know where you would have mapped her on the learning curve aspect of it, about how she was doing on the
That was my point.
But you just said it's not whether or not that's the best you can do. It's that there's a baseline that should be accepted, that's separate from is this the best you can do? It's that it's what it should be.
Well, that's what triggered my response.
So your real question was like, does this meet the minimum acceptable submission requirements of like basic acceptability?
No, that's not the bar I tried to establish. But I was really talking about baseline, meaning are the things for which you don't need to climb a learning curve right? Are they the best that they should be? And I didn't draw the distinction between the baseline skills, formatting, spelling, sentence structure, the things that you should have nailed down long before this.
Yep.
Is that right? And I gave them a template.
Yep.
To show what does an outline look like? 1A, whatever the organization of an outline. So all of that stuff. Now, if the idea isn't well formed, or they didn't capture this main idea, or their transitions weren't there, or it's not persuasive because they didn't address the primary arguments, all of that is part of the evolution.
Right. But I would go back to argue then, because I know you didn't have a lot of time, but a simple statement like when you're formatting and spelling and basic things are off, it overshadows whether you did a good enough job on the actual, that's distracting from whether you even did the good thing. Because I do take it back to you, like, do you want her to learn what your irritation is, or do you want to send her on a goose chase of trying to figure out which thing you didn't like?
Well, I mean, I think inherent in your question is a little bit of there's a dichotomy there, because you're asking, do you want to, the same way my wife asked me, do you want to take out the trash? I really...
Okay.
Was my best purpose to have her go off in a million directions? No. I can't really say I didn't want her to, because I thought that was funny. But that being said, I think that the purpose of it, and part of the purpose is to look at different aspects of it. I didn't want her just saying, and the reason I didn't say fix the spelling errors is because I didn't want her to just go back, take 2 seconds and submit it. I did want her to think. I did not want her to be so stressed out about, maybe I shouldn't talk about this. I should talk about that. And maybe whatever directions it went in. But I did I didn't want to be so obvious to say, if you check line 3, the second word.
You're not going to redline it for her and send it back.
Yeah, I did want her to think about it. But you're right. The point that you made about it overshadows, the small errors will overshadow the large work product. And it reminds me, I had a lawyer that worked for me a while ago, and he was very exacting. Reminded me of an engineer type. He was military, but he reminded me of an engineer type, very exacting. And he just had an incredibly difficult time finding anybody to whom he felt comfortable delegating work, because he would judge them immediately and irreparably. So that if you had a secretary that would return something and maybe there was a typo here, or maybe she didn't return the form exactly the way he had formatted it because she missed something or she didn't know, whatever. But even if she missed something, he would categorize her as incompetent. And then he would never back off of that judgment. Now, that's severe. That's at one end of the range. But at the same time, it does speak to the fact that sometimes you can't hear the substance because of the noise of the appearance.
Correct. But that is an incredibly important lesson. And so if we're sort of trying to extrapolate this out, not trying to decide whether or not that was the thing you should have said in that moment, but I think
it wasn't the thing I should have said in the moment. I think we know that.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm glad we're not debating that. No, but it's like, what do you want the person? Where do you want their brain to go? What do you want them to get out of it? What are the chances that they're going to misunderstand it?
Well, what I wanted her to get out of it, and and from this discussion, it really is in 2 levels. The first thing is, for this immediate assignment, I just really wanted her to take another look at it and fix certain things, the obvious things. And I didn't set her up. I wanted her to meet baseline.
Right.
And I didn't set it up that way. In a larger discussion, the second level, which takes a lot more preparation, I believe, I want to be able to ask that question and have the recipient consider not just baseline, but really whether this work adequately represents them the way they want to be represented. And those are 2 different, it's 2 different procedures to set up those results.
Absolutely. I actually had an English teacher in high school who had a set of, it's funny. Interestingly, I had a math teacher in middle school who also did something almost exactly like this. They had a set of criteria. It was like a 4, 5, 7 list set of things. If your name and date and the title of the class, I'm making it up because I don't remember, aren't in the top right-hand corner, if you don't obey the 1-inch margins, there were like 4 or 5 what you would refer to as baseline things. Yeah. If you don't do these things, I'm not even grading your, it set this criteria. It will not be graded. It will be returned to you as a 0. Right. And that got our attention. We knew very clearly that there was a baseline expectation for a certain amount of rigor around that baseline stuff. And then separate from that was the more nuanced conversation. I think that's what's interesting is that in every job, in every project, in every homework assignment, in every company, there are things that are not not pay to play, but like the sort of prerequisite. There's an expression for that. I can't think what it is. It's like if you want to participate,
the price of admission.
That's what I was thinking of. There's like price of admission requirements that you got to do this to even be taken seriously. When I was back in my architecture days, I used to get all the resumes, and someone submitted a resume via email, which was fine. Didn't do a formal cover letter. Even that was fine because that's not always, whatever. But the email itself not only was not in letter form, but they were using like text short code things like
nice.
You are for your. And I was like, whoa, no, this is not going to work. Because it dips so below a certain baseline expectation that you're like, sorry, no, this is not even acceptable. I didn't even open his resume because I was like, this is such a glaring poor judgment of what's baseline okay.
But I think that's the important conversation. As we're talking, I realize that there are certain discussions I should have just in my firm and whatever, which is what are for each job, for each output, whatever that happens to be. At what point would I say, you know what, if it doesn't meet these criteria, I'm not even grading it. Or if it doesn't meet these things, it's not going out to the client. Or if
your contribution to the company isn't this, then we're not going to work, to make this part work or something.
Right. So I think that I know I have to give more of an effort to separate what's the price of admission when you come in, because there's a temptation to say, well, I like this person. I can train up. I can train them. But really what I find myself dissatisfied with, and it's unfair because even if I've said that in hiring, I can train up. What I really need is I can train up from a baseline, but I haven't adequately identified the baseline.
You know where I think this conversation, now I can tell we're like on the thread of it. Cause now I have like 12 things I want to say. So
and we're right at like 1 minute left.
All right, I'm going to make it fast.
To our point.
No. It's, there's a conversation I've gotten into several times lately where, I think this can happen even when the position already exists, but I think it's really, really fraught with a possible way things go if it's a brand new position. So I had a client who added a position to a team and everyone thought it was the right move. The person in it just wasn't working at or the thing wasn't working out. And well, with a data set of 1, it's a little bit hard to say, like, is it the wrong person? Is it the wrong position? Was it the wrong position in the first place? Like it never would have worked no matter who's in that job. And they kept, but forget that part of it for a second. I see this all the time where something's not working. You're tempted, like the person seems nice. It seems like they're trying. So maybe you move them into a different position, or you're kind of moving people around or trying to like cut the cloth to make everything work. And it can be hard to differentiate, like, where's that price of admission line?
Yes.
Because a lot of times when we back it up and separate the variables, we do a lot of sort of untangling of all the different pieces. And what often comes out when somebody has been moving somebody around or trying to recut the job in a different shape, often what ends up coming out is that there is in some way that they are simply not meeting the price of admission criteria. And that is different from the more nuanced, like, oh, maybe this just isn't quite the right fit for you. But if we nudged you over here, which happens sometimes, you nudge them over there and zing, it works and off they go and it's fantastic. But if you've moved them around, if you've tried this, if you tried that, you've taken this away, you've added this and it's not working, my hunch is that if you back up and look at it, it's more of an issue with the price of admission.
And that was and should have been my clearly expressed point. She didn't hit my price of admission.
Of course.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Eliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.